Hello and welcome to the first episode of Nuts and Bolts, a Writing 101 series where we will be tackling issues that writers face and proposing tools to solve them. Joining me tonight is my long-term writing and editing partner, Tobias Tobak, and tonight we are going to be talking about trust. You trust me, right, Tobias?
Almost implicitly.
Good answer. Very diplomatic. Specifically, though, tonight we're going to be talking about how to build trust between the writer and the reader. Now, we're going to be discussing a lot of books, movies, and other storytelling mediums tonight, so beware that there will be spoilers ahead. We're going to endeavor to only talk about things that have been out for a while, but while I'll do my best to remember to put the little spoiler tag in the bottom, we are live and forgetful creatures. So if spoilers are a really big deal for you, this might not be the stream for you.
Go
right ahead.
It's also just worth noting that what one person considers a spoiler isn't, what we might think is just like, oh, that's not a spoiler. That's just, a kind of secondary thing or not important. Someone else, it might be a spoiler. And just, if we start what we will say when we're going to be talking about a certain, piece of media and
take it from there. And as always, if you are watching live and want to have your questions answered, please feel free to leave comments. We will try to answer everything you throw our way and have a lot of fun. So until then, let's jump right in and start talking about what is an author promise. Now, Tobias and I have been working together for 15-ish years now. Yeah, about 15 years. So we've had a lot of discussions about this, usually like at 2 a.m. in the morning in the kitchen while we've both gone down for a snack, because we do, in fact, live together, not only write together. So what would you define as an author promise?
Well, it's a promise that an author makes. It's an author promise encompasses a really broad range of different kind of elements of writing. And this also applies to, filmmaking and
any medium that is a storytelling medium.
Narrative media, yeah. For me, it's author promises is really anything where either explicitly in the text or implicitly through cultural signifiers or genre tropes, you are setting up the reader or the viewer's expectations.
That's pretty good emphasis. And also building that foundational trust with a reader, their belief that if you throw something crazy at them, there will be a reason. And that trust, especially when you're dealing with a new author you haven't read before or a new medium, can be really important to build quickly. Because if not, something bizarre might just be considered a plot hole, and a book can be, did not finish, slush pile of doom. As I've become more and more of a writer, I've noticed author promises more and more, to the point that now, like, a promise that fails to deliver will be like a splinter under my nail, and it drives me insane. We're going to talk about some of those later, because, oh man, so much. But let's cover the basics first, which is how to set up reader expectations in a whole variety of ways. And in this, we're mainly going to be discussing the opening acts of various stories and types of media. We are talking about the first sentence, the first paragraph, the first page, chapter, and even the first, really the act, where you're setting up all your different elements, your characters, your setting, your plot, all of it. So first off, I'd like to talk a little bit about reader expectation and tone. The foundational feel of a medium. Tobias, do you want to start us off here, talking a little bit about it?
I feel like tone is just such a ambiguous, amorphous thing to.
I think that the best place is film.
Yeah.
That's the easiest, like, most explicitly visual and like fool around. The color scheme of a dystopian. This week, with all the fires in California, I've seen a lot of comparison videos between the videos from California and videos from Blade Runner. And this, reddish, creepy tint to the sky and these urban landscapes, that sets a distinct tone for a story and tells the audience, hey, something isn't right here. We're in the dark timeline. We are in an unpleasant future. The same happens in books with the language choices we make.
That's a good one, because you have, obviously, if you have, character swearing and using really explicit language, that is, part of that sets the tone, that sets the feeling of this is a more adult piece of media or a harsher, more aggressive piece of media, depending on what it is.
Absolutely. In the book I just released this weekend, the first line of the first chapter is just a string of F words in a variety of formats, because the book deals with a lot of really intense, dark topics. And we wanted to just smack the reader over the head with it and say, if you don't like swearing, if you don't like pirates, if you don't like things going bad right from the get-go, this is not the book for you.
And that's, I think, like, such an important part of, especially those, like, first sentence, first page author promises, is, are you going to enjoy this book as a reader? Is this, and something... One of my favorite examples of this is the first book of the Black Jewels trilogy by Anne Bishop. The first chapter is just this really dark, brutal scene. It's like probably the most brutal scene in the entire first book. But the later books are going to go back to that kind of a tone and go back to that kind of intensity.
And it doesn't shock the reader.
And it doesn't shock the reader. And whereas, like, a lot of people don't want to read that. They have, the people read for different reasons. If someone sees that first chapter and is like, this is disgusting, I hate this, they're not going to read the book. And that's fine. If someone reads it and they're like, this is a really interesting setting and these kind of complex characters, how they're reacting to this, then that's going to get them in, and you don't have and we're going to talk a little bit later about, kind of the difference between, like, sides, the difference between a plot twist and just sideswiping someone with something unexpected.
Yes.
And how that kind of the line you have to drive with that also.
Absolutely. I would much rather, as an author, someone decide to put my book down after the first chapter than after the midway point.
Yeah.
Because I don't want someone investing a whole bunch of time, and I don't want to invest a whole bunch of time in a book that I'm not going to enjoy in the end. It's like, if you read a romance book and you don't get a happily ever after, you didn't read the book you set out to read. It's a trick, and that kind of dirty trick can be a tool in your toolbox. It can be something that you do for the shock value to completely, like, change what it is you're doing. And so many stories, if you just twisted that one element. I was just watching a stream about how Twilight would be an excellent horror story. As written, if it was just tonally shifted to horror and away from romance, it would be a cautionary tale about vampires.
I've seen some really interesting, like, taking Twilight as specifically as, like, if you take the angle of, like, the loss of control and things.
Absolutely.
But I think it's that you also get, and this is when you're dealing with, like, TV or cinema or other kind of audiovisual languages, you have all these other elements. You have, again, the color palette, you have
the music,
stylistic animation styles, or effects, physical locations. You have a lot more that can be communicated in a very short period of time.
Yes.
And whereas
same with comic books.
Same, yeah, and but you can, and that and tripping over myself here, but there's also some interesting things, and this can definitely happen with in a lot of different areas, but I feel like especially with tone is like a really big part of it is based on cultural context.
Yes.
Where you have the obvious things like, okay, if someone's getting murdered in the first scene, we know that this is a book that people can get murdered in. And you have those kind of service level things. But the deeper stuff in terms of like what kind of language you use and how you describe things.
Whether everything is described colloquially. Clockwork Orange is a beautiful example of this, where they're talking another language and it's horrific and it's just there and is exactly what it is. And if you can't take it on that first page, you will not be able to take it all the way through. And kind of, I'm going to transition us into a little bit about talking about the authorial promises within setting and where you decide to put your novel and where do you decide to put your opening.
Yes. So we both primarily come from a background of science fiction and fantasy. So we are dealing with, primarily not Earth.
Yes. I'm actually going to interrupt us really quickly because I had a really great audience comment. Chan says a really great movie that sets up its promises early and really solidly is Repo the Genetic Opera.
Yes, that is a really, really great example.
It's super dark. It's super musical. You get this dissonance in those early scenes between bright colors and dark colors and like discordant music. And it is one of the most like, yes, absolutely. That is a fantastic example.
Yeah.
Back to setting, I think we were talking about.
Yes,
we lose track of ourselves so much during this.
See, I was saying that like setting, and I feel like it's not a cut and dry binary, but there definitely is a spectrum of Earth to completely alien.
Yes.
And then in the middle you have magical realism or
portal fantasy,
medieval fantasy. You have these different kind of degrees, and there's a lot of again, you get what kind of promises you're making to your reader are to a great deal dependent on what else has that reader already read.
Absolutely. Taking cultural cues. For example, nowadays you set something in, say, you set something in New Zealand and you see panorama shots of New Zealand, and 9 times out of 10, the first thing people are going to think of is this is a fantasy movie. And, if you're doing a small town romance and you set it up with sweeping views of New Zealand for the first, however long that takes, people will think that you were right. You were doing something completely different.
Yeah.
So no, absolutely. Cultural cues. And I think that comes down to a situation where sometimes, because of these authorial promises that we make in relation to our culture, when you move a piece of media outside of the culture that created it, you can sometimes have a disconnect where it either doesn't fulfill its promises to the reader because somewhere in that language and that contract, there was a misunderstanding, or something that would feel totally normal and mundane to the author becomes a fantasy for someone else.
And you kind of compound that with the fact that things don't exist in a set place in time. I have recently been rereading Wind Up Girl by Paolo Bacigalupi, which
my favorite sci-fi.
It is a post-apocalyptic dystopia, and it was inspired by the author's experience being in East Asia during SARS. So, and without going into any more detail about the story, what it's about, there's just this sense of like, this feels very different reading it right now
Today
in
in
September
2020.
of 2020 than it did when I first time read it a few years ago.
Whereas when I read it the first time, I was in Thailand. And I was in the setting, seeing it, tasting it, smelling it, and it was a very differently vivid thing. I saw a lot of the beauty in it, that read through, and then when I read it again, comfortably home, I saw a lot of the horror and the really like dark things that I'd kind of overlooked in my wide-eyed excitement for where I was. So actually, I'm going to just kind of jump ahead in our outline a little bit, but I think that really comes down to understanding your audience. And for writers, we often live in two camps. Either you're writing for yourself or you're writing for an audience. Now, commercial writers, and I'm going to mostly put this discussion in that direction because that's what I am. I'm writing professionally. I'm trying to make a living at it. So audience expectations are a really big part of that. But being able to write to the touchstones that an audience has specifically. And we have all of these shortcuts.
Yeah.
So, audience, your authorial promises have to come quickly. They have to come in that like first paragraph, first chapter. So the moment you have a dragon, even in the distance, that's a promise that it's fantasy. If you have, again, every genre has its own specific promises. And what those are tropes. So I'm going to take a little break for anyone who is not familiar with the concept of trope versus cliche. The word trope gets a bad name in general media. It is considered something bad and to avoid, and that is not. A played out trope that has become stereotypical and boring and predictable is a cliche. A trope is is an authorial promise to the reader. It is if I set it up like this, expect the emotional payoff like this. If I present a story that goes back and forth between two leads, and I spend a lot of time talking about how they're what they physically look like, and they have a meet cute moment within the first act, it's likely that that's a romance story, whether it's in a fantasy or elsewhere. So the tropes of a romance genre that must be obeyed are a meet cute moment early on and a happily ever after of some kind. It can come after a lot of struggles, especially if it's like a secondary romance plot, but you better bet that if romance is the primary genre, that will be the primary ending, and to break it is to break a promise to the reader. Do we want to talk about any like specific genres and their promises? Because I feel like we've had a lot of fun discussions about this.
It's something that I trying to think that we definitely have discussed this, and now I'm just drawing a complete blank because I'm on camera, and that's how cameras work. They eat your brain.
They do eat your brain. Worse than zombies. Like, they're much more insidious. We turn them on. So let's talk a little bit about the young adult trope. Because this is something both of us read young adult fiction fairly regularly.
Yes, and I think that this is also where, obviously every genre has subgenres, but I feel like, young adult is a market, not a genre.
Yes.
I mean, but it's but in terms of, you definitely have your paranormal young adult and your, fantasy young adult, and
yes. And I'd say that the kind of author promises in a young adult novel are introduce a young protagonist. Like, that is the number one promise of a young adult novel, is this is a story about someone who is becoming a fully functional member of whatever culture they are in, or choosing to go on their own way. Like, that is the implicit promise in a young adult novel. I would also expect most young adult novels to give me a signpost within the first opening paragraph, whether that be a setting or a tone thing, about whether they are primarily action adventure, whether they are primarily romance, or whether they are like where in the young adult sphere. I think that we see this really well in Richard Roberts. We were talking about earlier. Go for it. You know him best.
Because Richard Roberts does, I think, a very good job of playing with genres and subverting them, but like subverting them in a way that still plays into the genre.
Genre expectation, yes.
And that's, you know, again, it's kind of a difficult balance you have to strike.
For those who don't know, Richard Roberts is a indie young adult.
He's not indie.
He's hybrid young adult writer, somewhere between middle grade and young adult. It kind of waffles. It's hard to draw a line there sometimes. He writes a lot of like sci-fi fantasy, almost crossover, very light sci-fi, superheroes. I haven't read Cyborg yet.
No, I know that he has. I think one of the things he does really well is the creepy cute.
Yes.
He, you know, deals with a lot of really dark themes, and, you know, in terms of like characters having to face dark things about themselves or about other people.
And I think his opening, I don't know if you have it memorized or not, but or have it pulled up, but his opening for his superhero book, go ahead and read it.
So the first book is Please Don't Tell My Parents I'm a Supervillain, which, like, I feel like even just as a title
is a promise.
It's, you know,
it's promising the central conflict of the entire series, which is a child who is a supervillain and doesn't want to tell her parents, which is super relatable. And that is a promise. And it's amazing what titles can do to a promise.
So the first line, you know, first sentence of the first chapter of that book is, on the last day before I got my superpower, I was sulking because I didn't have a superpower. And I love that so much, because it not only just sets up this tone, it sets up the, you know, okay, obviously it's a first person story, so we're getting the character's emotions in that moment, but we're finding, you know, it's like, this is a world that has superpowers. This is a world where it is, we don't know if it's normal for people to have superpowers, but it is, you know, a thing that somebody could expect to have and want. It is a thing that a person can go from not having to having. And
even just the choice of the word sulked tells me that we're in a younger perspective.
Yes.
Author choice of words early on, super important to telling that tone. Between the title and that first line, we know it's a young person. We don't know exactly what their age is, but we know that we are in middle grade or young adult fiction. Now, I'm going to actually move us on to sci-fi.
Okay, I did want to just very briefly on the topic of, before we go to sci-fi, is one of the things you get when you're dealing with the closer you get to real world things, is the way that real life affects those tropes and there's, you know, a lot of the stuff in Harry Potter that we consider, oh, that's a Hogwarts thing, is actually just a British thing.
Yes.
Like a lot of the fact that their school's divided into houses and has prefects and stuff is like, and that's not a Harry Potter thing. That's just a British schools, you know, thing.
Yeah.
And you get the same thing with Japanese media, that it, you know, I think can be, if you're not familiar with that culture, it can, and I think those we were talking about earlier with the kind of the familiar becoming fantastical.
Yes. So moving on to sci-fi. Science fiction is one of my favorite places for authorial promises, because you are making either one promise or another. There are only two promises in sci-fi. Is the science real other than my gimme, or is it not? Like, that is the biggest promise that you have to make as early as possible. Basically, is the science going to come to bite you? Now, this is not a specific, like, subgenre. This is not like humor versus not humor. You recently in Avenue 5 or whatever the new sci-fi series with Hugh Laurie was, it's funny, it's silly, it's kind of like bad jokes sometimes, but real science, real space, like problems, like the gravity around the spaceship itself and things like that, it becomes a huge plot point. So early on, it's established that while this might be silly and lighthearted and it's not a heavy thing like The Expanse, real science still applies.
Yeah.
You have Douglas Adams, where within the first couple pages, you have just random stuff happening. You're talking about, you know, spaceships demolishing the Earth in 1 second, you know, no time at all. We're talking about, you know, alien races that, you know,
I think Ford Prefect is a perfectly reasonable name for a human being.
Exactly. So we have two very big camps of science fiction. Those are the biggest promise you can make your audience, and the quickest you should be making is science real or not? The next biggest promise that I see in sci-fi is, okay, this is the setting. What's the story? And trying to instill in the reader the understanding of what story you are telling. Are you telling like a mystery? Are you telling a space exploration, a space opera? I think that covers, especially in sci-fi, do a lot to actually make this first impression of an authorial promise. If there are spaceships on the cover, it's going to be space opera, space battle, something about space. If there are people with guns on the cover, it's going to be a like on the ground actions thing. Those are some like the big indicators. Tobias, do you have any like specific sci-fi promises that you can think of?
I was thinking about Scalzi, John Scalzi, and
the amazing John Scalzi.
He has written some varying levels of, you know, scientific realism. I don't know what spoilers we're discussing, but there's going to be somewhere. Yes. Depends on which book we decide on, because there's a few good ones.
So many.
I feel like Old Man's War is a great
example.
Spoilers for Old Man's War by John Scalzi, because you set up you begin the story with a character basically being recruited into the military and setting up this kind of unique set up the conceit of the story.
And it does one thing very interesting very early on in this light-hearted, bubbly, funny science fiction. It sets up very vividly how a character died before the book started. And this is something that is huge. If you, as a writer, are going to write characters dying, set that up as early as possible. If you are writing a story where bad things can happen to the main character, have a bad thing happen to the main character in chapter 1. You do not want your readers to get attached to something and then rip it out away from them, unless that's a specific genre you are writing. Specifically dark dystopia and zombie novels, that's an expected part of the genre, that you're going to give someone plot armor for pages and pages and pages, and then they're going to die a vicious, horrible death.
Yeah. And part of why people will, you know, read that is because that sense of
impending
threat, of impending doom, is something that they enjoy. And which, you know, which is another thing that the Expanse books do, is, you know, it's another book where the first scene, the prologue to the first book, is this really visceral, brutal scene. And so you go in and you get some things about the setting, but you get this like, okay, this is a setting where bad things happen to people. This is a setting that is where people don't feel safe.
A beautiful example of this going to fantasy is Game of Thrones. And we'll be talking about Game of Thrones later.
We're going to be talking about Game of Thrones later.
There's going to be a lot of talk about Game of Thrones, but we're specifically talking about the opening episode / opening chapters of Game of Thrones and the things that are set up. Monsters in the wild are set up. The mysterious, the threat of the unknown. Characters making mistakes, running away from their duty, not doing what they're supposed to do, dishonorable characters, or characters who are doing something because they are genuinely terrified and they're doing the best they can. Then someone going through with an execution of said character. By doing that, by the time that Ned Stark drops his sword and cuts off someone's head, you've already established that it's a dark setting where good people can make mistakes and suffer consequences for it. Where children watch executions as part of life, where it is cold and bleak, but there is magic and it is mysterious and not well understood. And if at any point during the series suddenly magic became super hard and super understood, or they broke out into song or something, I'm talking boisterous song, not we're about to die songs.
The Gallivant episode of...
Yes, if there was a Gallivant episode of Game of Thrones, it would break all those author promises.
Speaking of really setting, in your first episode, setting up what the tone of your entire show is going to be.
Gallivant! If you do not watch Gallivant, it's on Netflix. Watch it now, right now. Stop watching us. Go watch Gallivant. It is so beautiful. It opens with a song, and by the end of that song, you have the entire world setting, character motivations, conflict, everything is set up in a single song. It's a work of pure genius. Yes, if you want something that absolutely does it right, do that. And we'll talk about how Game of Thrones did it wrong later.
The Game of Thrones TV show.
Yes. We're not talking about the book.
We're not talking about A Song of Ice and Fire, the series.
Or we're talking about Game of Thrones specifically. All right. So I want to talk a little bit about the power of an author promise and a power of tropes as a hold your horses. Basically, when the author uses a trope or promise to say, you trust me, right? We both know what's going on here. I promise I'll get to this. And to do that, we're going to jump ahead a little bit and talk about Chekhov's gun. So, for those of you who are not familiar...
You want to turn off our spoiler ticker? I think.
Yes, I can turn off our spoiler ticker. This is not a spoiler. This is a trope. It is
a spoiler for literally everything. Ever written.
Yes. So, the concept of Chekhov's gun is that if there is a gun somewhere in the scene, it will eventually go off. And to add to that, Hitchcock added, and if you put a timer on a bomb and show it to the audience in Act 1, the entire time that timer is ticking down adds so much more suspense than if you just make an explosion happen in the third act. So combining those two elements, that is the perfect example of a very straightforward promise. And truthfully, this amount of thought should be put into every element that you choose to put into the opening act of a novel. Obviously, later on, there can be a cup on a table and people are just drinking wine. That is perfectly fine. That first opening image to any story, every element serves a purpose. So I'm going to actually break down the opening scene of my first novel. Tobias and I worked on this prologue again and again and again and again.
It has had completely different iterations in terms of who was there and when it happened and
whose
what was
POV
happening,
we were in.
whether or not certain characters were alive before or after, or
Yes. So the book opens with the line, Willem Lyrian dressed in red on the day he planned to kill his father. Because I knew that I was trying to tell a story about patricide. Where that was a problem, that I set up one character wants this goal.
I feel like the word plan is so good there, because it just tells you a lot, because it's not William Leary dressed in red the day he killed his father. It's the day he planned to kill his father.
So kind of back to Game of Thrones, I'm promising that people might not get to their plans. Promising a whole bunch there. But then every element of the first, I'd say, 2 paragraphs is showing a dysfunctional family, showing a situation where a character is trying to achieve something to break away from this status quo. Within that first paragraph, we mention advisors and thrones, and like these, the mother is doing embroidery and looking down at her lap and speaking in a hushed tone. The father is gruff. We are setting up that this is a fantasy world, that there's royalty involved, that it's a patriarchal fantasy world. We're making all these various promises that we won't confirm or deny for chapters later. The first time that we get a scene with the mother is, I don't know, like 40, 50,000 words later. It's not there, but we are basically saying, hold your horses, this is what the situation is. And by the end of the novel, this family dynamic will be resolved. Now, going back to Chekhov's gun, in any given story, what you open with, someone in the audience said open-minded, a funeral. I'm sure that I would be delighted to know how that plays out. Like what promise you intended to make, and how do you fulfill that promise. But I don't know where I was going with this. I was going somewhere with this.
Chekhov's gun.
So suspense. The role of a promise is to create suspense and create the trust that between the reader and author. When you're reading a new book, a new author, you do not trust them. So if you're going to set up Chekhov's gun to go off, you need to set off like a Chekhov's firecracker early, if that makes sense. Every time you make a promise and fulfill it, you build the reader's trust. So when I open with Willem Lyrian planned to kill his father, and I closed my prologue with whether he succeeded or failed, that was me trying to build trust with the reader to say, if I ask a question, I will answer it. And there is this fine line between setting things up to pay off where you expect it to pay off and it does, surprising the reader, getting the reader to trust you only to pull the rug out from under them. Like, there are just so many. It is such a complicated topic, and it's why we're breaking it down so much and why there's so much to discuss, and there's no real right or wrong way. But when it's done right, it is what transports you. It is what creates a suspension of disbelief. And it is what creates that feeling of nail-biting, just not knowing what's going to happen next, because you're trusting that the writer had a plan the whole time.
I think one of my favorite things is when you're pretty sure you have it figured out, but you're not 100% sure because it's not, because there's definitely the things where like a thing is set up and you're like, okay, I know how this is going to end. And especially like if you're dealing with a writer who tends not to play with tropes too much, and you're like, and you're like, okay, this is somebody who I can expect that if they set up a romance it's going to be happily ever after. If they set up a mystery, the mystery is going to be solved.
Yeah.
You know, and that's again, that's kind of what that trust you're building. If you are a writer who the thing you do is play with tropes and do these twisty turny, this thing that you thought was going one way is actually going the other way.
So I have to break in there again. Spoilers for John Scalzi. The last John Scalzi book I read was the culmination of his interdependency books. And the ending of that book, I'm not going to tell you what it is, but the ending of that book was absolutely crazy and trope, like genre flipping and bizarre. And I left it feeling deeply disappointed because this writer had made promises with every book that I had ever read of his that something strange and different is going to happen at the end of every single one of my books. And it's when you read back, you'll be able to see all the pieces I laid out. I made really subtle, interesting promises that from like totally different points of views, but it's going to be something crazy. And guess what? It was. It was crazy. It was wacky. It fulfilled all the promises that he had made. And yet it had become a cliche. I realized that in that one moment, with that one specific twist, that he would have, for me as a reader, done a better job of fulfilling his promises by doing the expected there.
But that's also like, somebody who is not familiar with his books reading, and this is the first
would probably have
an
entirely different experience. So again, it is so complicated to cater to readers because every one of them is going in with different expectations.
And also, the things that, whether you figure out the twist, and like everyone's going to be different on that. But also kind of that what you were saying about the interdependency book reminds me, this is a few different things I've read or seen have this problem where you establish that people can die and come back to life. You establish that somebody can be killed and either resurrection is possible or ghosts exist or there's another dimension that you can travel to. And then when you actually permanently kill off a character, I don't have an emotional response because I just feel like, okay, I'm not sitting here like, oh my God, this character that I have all these emotions about is dead. This character that I care about is dead. It's, I wonder how they're going to bring him back. I wonder what they're going to do with, this situation. And then there's this weird thing where the death is disappointing and the fact that they stay dead is also disappointing.
Yes, I think this is a cliche. If a person dies off screen, right, they're alive. It's just an understood fact. And to the point where that could almost be a writer promise. If a writer in a fantasy novel has a character die off screen, they're promising you that they're coming back. Like, unless
if you don't see the body.
If you don't see the body, that person is coming back, and it can be really great. It can add a ton of suspense. It's like that ticking time bomb. When are they going to pop back up? How are they going to show back up? It is, and especially if the author starts winking towards it. Oh, there was a mysterious person, or oh, you got a message. They, as Justin in our chat said, no corpse, no kill. It's really, really interesting to play with those trope subversions, the cliches that have become such cliches. They actually circle all the way back around to being an actual really
double
subversion. It's great. I love that kind of stuff. Actually, let's talk about trope subversion.
Yes.
Let's talk specifically, and I want to kind of talk about both trope subversion and when not to answer the questions that you pose. And before then, I'm just going to shout out to Chance, who says, I like it when the audience is given enough clues to figure things out if they're paying attention to the details.
I like the sudden but inevitable.
Yes.
Sudden, the thing that, you don't figure out until right when it's about to happen, but then when it, or, maybe you don't, but having that, like, you're starting to figure out, you think you know it, and then it happens and you're like, oh, of course, nothing else could have happened.
Yes.
Like, that is when it's done really, really well.
And I want to talk about when not fulfilling your author promises is also done really, really well. And for that, we're going to turn to a book that both Tobias and I absolutely love, which is The Giver by Lois Lowry. If you have probably read The Giver in school, if you haven't, it's a fantastic young adult book that deals with a lot of very, very intense, interesting emotions. And the author sets you up for this unfulfilled ending fairly early on if you're paying attention. There is enough, like, everything isn't how it seems as a constant thing. Every single time the character encounters something, it's never the way it seems on the surface. So the biggest promise that this book does is, I am a young adult novel that I will have a concrete ending. This is a trope genre standard of young adult novels have concrete endings. And what actually happens is entirely different. The ending is left to the audience discretion between a very happy ending and a very dark ending, and it is not clear what it is. I thought that was a really beautiful moment where the trope was subverted. Because it makes you think, because it makes you feel. And that is what that sudden, out of left field, it's raw, it's powerful. If you don't set something up and you make it happen and you pull it off, it can be amazing. But guess what? That spoiler tag at the bottom, that will destroy it. And there is something to be said about suspense versus shock. That just, I think it's time, Tobias. I think it's time to go on our rant about Game of Thrones.
But the entire internet has already ranted about Game of Thrones, Allegra.
I know, but we have to get in on it. This is our moment.
So I feel like I have to do my disclaimer. I have watched every single episodes of the Game of Thrones TV show. I have not read the books at all.
I have tried to read the books and failed miserably because I find them dull.
So that's just in terms of, like, the way that the books and the TV show are different. We are not going to, we are not qualified to go into, like, deep discussion of that. But we are able to go into deep discussion about this TV show that we spent years, like, every single week getting, we're not going to watch it without the other person because we have to watch the new episode together.
It's going to be real exciting. We're all going to get together.
All of our friends come over.
Yes. And for about 4 seasons, maybe 5, it was really fun. Because you know what? Those promises that they made right in that first episode about what kind of show it was, they were reestablished again and again and again. The trust that they built in us, that bad things happen, that characters die, that the world is... Yes. Come on. If someone doesn't know that people die on Game of Thrones, they have been living under a rock. But yes, spoiler tag.
Yes. I mean, yeah. I think my self-own with Game of Thrones is I had seen some of the later episodes while they were airing live before I watched the beginning of it. So there were some characters that I had swapped 2 characters in my head. So I went into it knowing, like, okay, I know this is Game of Thrones. I know everyone's going to die, but there's this handful of characters that I've seen in the newer episodes. I know that at least at that point in the story, these guys still exist. And I had swapped 2 of the characters, and one of them didn't exist.
Chan said, watching the fight between the Mountain and the Viper was amazing and a great example of both keeping and breaking promises. Yes, absolutely. That was a fight that was set up with one character fighting for one of the people who seemed to have plot armor. And one character fighting, a big bad person fighting against them. And they have this beautiful moment where it looks like until the very last moment that something finally good is going to happen. And we as an audience know that it's not. We as an audience have been trained by this piece of medium that nothing good is going to happen, but they stretch it out, and it looks like the good guys are going to win, and it looks like the good guys are going to win, and then the gun goes off. And it's swapped, and then it's fast, and it's brutal, and it goes wrong so quickly. And it was brilliant. Mm-hmm. It was shocking, even though we've been shocked by this before.
Yeah. And I think it was also interesting because, like, with something like Game of Thrones, where, like, okay, we have the sex, and we have the violence, and we have the gratuitous everything. And I feel like that fight specifically was an example of using the violence and the gore in a way that was still surprising because of how the story was structured around it. And that, again, you kind of think you know where things are going.
And guess what? We did know where things were going. You know why we knew where things were going? Because Game of Thrones was great at setting up author promises, and they were great at paying them off. And we all knew what direction Game of Thrones should have gone.
Yeah. And then just kind of circling back around to the first episode of Game of Thrones is Ned Stark's, like, if you have to execute someone, you do it yourself.
Yep.
Talk is just, like, so fundamentally, like, just you have these two characters, and I feel like so much of Jon's arc when the show was good ties back into that conversation.
And so when the final season, now we're going to big spoiler territory. So if you have not watched Game of Thrones, the end,
and you care,
which you should not, because it turned into a piece of crap, this is coming. So the showrunners understood that we all knew where it was going because they did a great job. They set themselves up for the perfect ending because we would have been genuinely pleased to see these people who finally survived all of it actually get their comeuppance, their rewards, all of that. We knew where it was going. There were seasons and seasons of plot arcs. And what did they do? They realized that we knew, and they tried to get clever.
Yeah, which this is the, kind of ties in with the surprises versus
suspense,
and the doing a surprising thing just
that
because
kind of ties in, maybe.
And especially with a piece of media that has been so built on this. Everything is interconnected, and everything has a purpose, and every little detail.
High intrigue.
Like, and this is again where it comes into the genre. There are genres where, like, you can just have those out of left field, everything wraps up neatly, and that's fine because that's what the reader expects.
Yes.
And that's not, in and of itself, does not make someone a bad writer.
But it wasn't the story they were telling. And from what the internet thinks, they saw a bunch of fan theories, and they saw the fan theories get it right, and they decided, well, how about you get it wrong instead, losers?
And you just get this.
It toppled.
It toppled. You have so many characters who have their arcs just kind of negated.
Yes.
Have these, these characters who have spent all of these seasons learning new skills and changing and growing, especially the kids. Like,
actually, I was going to say especially Jaime Lannister.
Yes.
Jaime Lannister, to me, the promise that Jaime Lannister made to the audience the entire way through is he takes 2 steps forward and 1 step back. 2 steps forward and 1 step back the entire time. That is Jaime Lannister. He's an asshole, but he learns, and it's beaten into him by life. It is not a pleasant experience. He loses body parts, he loses dignity, he loses people he loves, but he does steadily become a better character. The end of his arc said, well, wouldn't it be shocking if he was just the shallow, horrible person that he was in episode 1? Wouldn't that be different? And it wasn't. It wasn't different. It wasn't good.
Yeah.
They just dropped every promise they made for his character, for his sister's character. They had a whole prophecy about being killed by a certain, by a sibling, that they set it up and they set everything up. And then they decided that instead of setting off the Chekhov's gun that they had spent 8 seasons setting, they would just drop a building on them. Because that made sense. Same thing with Daenerys. They tried to cram a whole bunch of author promises in as if they had put them in earlier when they didn't. Retroactively changing things is an art form. We will talk about that right before we close out because we are getting to the end of our stream. But go.
But yeah, I just feel like that, like, while I definitely like have the like in Jaime Lannister, like, and Jaime and Brienne's whole relationship, and the fact that like he was changing and learning, and then at the end, like, he didn't just lapse, he just completely reverted. But yeah, for me, I feel like I just, the fact that with the kids, with the Stark kids, and also, I guess there are other kids, but mostly the Stark kids, because they're kids. They, this wasn't just like this stuff that was happening to them. It was this stuff that they were going through their teenage years, or going, and that these formative experiences, and to have like that, to have Sansa just was so not utilized as a character, and
everything was dropped. They just wanted to shock, and that is, I think, the message there is shock. When you break all your author promises to do it, almost never works. Especially if you're not in a genre that likes it.
Yeah, definitely.
But we are going to stop ranting because we will rant for hours. We have ranted for hours. I want to talk a little bit about how reframing changes a plot. This is something that takes effort. And when it's done well, it's great. And when it's done badly, it's horrible. And this is the concept that a piece of information given in the late game reframes all the promises that you took for granted up to this point. This is what Game of Thrones tried to do with a couple characters and failed. The reframe is, in and of itself, an author promise that you do have to set up. Like I said, the reinforcing promises, if you're going to set up a major twist at the end, any kind of twist, because twists are almost by default the reimagination of a promise, a twist needs to be set up with the reader by setting up smaller twists earlier on. We're going to go back to kind of talking about our own writing. There is a massive twist at the end of Where Shadows Lie. I won't say what it is, but within the prologue, we also have a massive twist, which is basically telling the audience the genre tropes will be twisted in this, because within the end of the prologue, the chosen one dies. It's gone. That's the chosen one. That is Kupo. Please don't let anything happen to that beautiful angel. He knew his name. He came when called. So by setting up that twist, my hope is that the later twist, the audience says, oh, okay, this doesn't make sense right away, but I'm going to read on to find out how it does, because I know that something happened, that this isn't accidental, that this writer has done something again, has done something before that set this up. And that is what they didn't do in Game of Thrones.
And there's also, when you're dealing with scope, that, obviously if you're writing a short story or a novella, your, act 1 and act 3 are right on top of each other. If you're writing a long series, then you are constantly setting up promises that you're not actually fulfilling in that book, because that's what ties all of the books together.
But that's where trust comes in. You have to build trust with your audience that you will answer those questions, even if not in this book or this episode, or, you know.
And like, I know that Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson is a really fantastic book. I do not recommend it to people as the first Brandon Sanderson book they read.
Because you have to trust Brandon Sanderson for that book.
It is a fantastic book, but it is long and it is dense and it is complicated, and it's
worth it.
It's like, if you like that kind of really intricate, involved, lots of moving pieces, lots of strange world building that you have to like learn all the stuff about the world to kind of make sense of it.
It's great. If you don't, it's horrible and boring.
I saw someone was complaining about it because at the end of each of the books, there's kind of a glossary, world building background section, and someone posted online that they'd been turned off by the book because their friend told them that, you know, you should read this book, but if you want to really get it, you have to read the glossary first.
Yes.
Which is such, for me, it's like, it's a matter of trust that you have to go in saying, if this book has all these complicated moving pieces. I've also heard people complain with the prologue of that book that it throws a bunch of jargon and terminology at you.
Yes, it does make the reader work. And again, if you have trust in Brandon Sanderson, if you've read his previous books, you will push through that and see why it was there.
Yeah, and you have this thing, okay, I know, like, again, if you like that kind of book and you're reading it because you've read this author's work before, you can say, okay, I trust that this is all going to come to dog.
That it's all going to come together and make sense. And if you don't, then
he's going to explain everything. And that's, the other thing. You don't have to
read. To end this, I think, I actually want to just boil it down to Sanderson's first law. Brandon Sanderson is not everyone's cup of tea, but his first law of magic of 3, to me, is one of the best pieces of general writing advice anywhere.
My dog is underneath my desk, bumping the tripod that my phone is, my camera's on.
So Sanderson's first law is your ability to resolve a conflict with magic is directly proportional to the reader's understanding of said magic. And if you take magic out of it, your ability to resolve a plot with any element is directly proportional to your reader's understanding of that element. If you're going to, murder someone with a knife in the 3rd act, there must be a knife somewhere. The Chekhov's gun. If you're going to have a happily ever after in the end, you must have a meet cute. You must establish the thing that is going to be at the heart and soul of the resolution, whether that is micro, something that happens within one chapter, or macro, something that happens over an entire series. And that is the core of an authorial promise, is providing the reader with the tropes, with the tone, with the setting, with the character, with the props that are necessary to achieve the resolution that they are going for. And be very cautious about breaking them, because that in and of itself is part of some tropes and can ruin a book. It can be great, but it can absolutely destroy a series like Game of Thrones. Yeah. So we are actually a little over our clock. We got kind of carried away there.
I definitely had some things I wanted to talk about that we'll have to come back to another time.
Yes, if there are any specific parts of this that you as an audience really are interested in and want to hear more of our thoughts on the matter, leave us a comment. We love doing nitty-gritty videos, so I would absolutely do a video just on Chekhov's gun and Alfred Hitchcock and his beautiful ability to put in suspense. I know that we had a couple authors that people wanted us to talk about, and we are out of time, unfortunately, but again, We love doing specific episodes. If you want to support us, please like and subscribe. The YouTube algorithms love that. Leave us a comment if you like what we did or want something specific in the future. If you want to talk to us directly, we have a Discord. It is hopping and full of awesome writers, and we invite a lot of audience members on as guests. So please do feel free to jump into our Discord. We love to see new faces. Finally, if you are interested in what we said today and the kind of novels that we might think up, we have two. NACL Eye of the Storm by myself and the lovely E. Sands came out this Sunday and is crazy, post-apocalyptic, arcane punk pirates with lots and lots of swearing and sex and rum drinking. And the other one is Where Shadows Lie, where the Chosen One dies at the beginning. It is epic fantasy with dragons.
Please stalk us on Discord, yes.
Yes, please stalk us on Discord. Again, we are very friendly and we love talking about this and can totally go off on like 10-hour tangents where we just blow up each other's Discords because some very specific niggly thing about a book caught our attention. Thank you all for watching. We will be back. I have some interviews planned. There's some more mice videos coming out. We're starting to talk about a potential RPG campaign here on the channel. So like and subscribe, and we'll see you